All right. Thank you for joining us today for understanding the new Maryland law, Senate Bill 528. I'm Tim O'Farrell, and I serve as Executive Director here at NAIOP Maryland, and we appreciate you all joining us today. Today, we hope is the first in a series of webinars we'll be putting together over the next several months to help you understand the impacts of this new law. We're really pleased today to have Stuart Kaplow to share with us an understanding of the law and its impacts on the industry. Before we get into that, I'd like to first thank all of our partners. You'll see them on your screen right now. They make our programming possible throughout the entire year. In addition to that, you also see on the next screen our penny per square foot fund contributors. These companies, we'd like to thank them for their support of our legislative activities in Annapolis every year. It's with their support, it makes it possible for us to have the success in mitigating and working with Annapolis on behalf of our industry. Couple of housekeeping items for everyone who's participating with us today. If you are looking for your Maryland CRE continuing education credits, one of the requirements is during this presentation, we ask that you keep your screen on. You have to see that you're actively listening in. So if you do want credits, please make sure to leave your cameras on. Otherwise, we do ask that you go on mute. We ask everyone to go on mute through the day. I'll be introducing Tom Ballantyne, our VP of Legislative Affairs, in a second. But if you have questions for Stuart or Tom throughout the session, we recommend that you use the chat feature. So if you use the chat, they will be monitoring that. Stuart will do his best to answer those live, and if not, we'll answer them through chat and possibly post this session. So that is it for the housekeeping today. We have you for about 90 minutes. It's a very deep content, a very important subject for us. So it's my pleasure now to invite Tom Ballantyne on the screen and share some opening remarks.
Thanks, Tim. Pleasant good morning to you all. My name is Tom Ballantyne. I'm the Vice President for Policy and Government Relations at NAIOP. And thanks for joining this webinar on the recent revisions to the Maryland's Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act. The bill that the General Assembly passed during this last session adopts economy-wide targets of net zero emissions by 2045. That's a goal that has been adopted by a number of other governments. But on the other hand, the near-term target of a 60% emissions reduction by 2031 is one of the most aggressive. So to put the economy-wide gap in perspective, the state's most recent greenhouse gas inventory puts the 2020 emissions at about 74 million metric tons of CO2 and equivalents. Reaching a 60% reduction by 2031 requires reducing economy-wide emissions to about 43.9 million metric tons. The state's current plan, which was adopted last year, would fall about 19 million metric tons short of that target. And the most optimistic model run ever run by MDE's climate consultants, which contains extremely aggressive assumptions about emissions from cars, electric generation, and other reductions, leaves about a 13 million metric ton gap, or about 11% to the new target. So that's an extremely challenging near-term goal. For buildings, the bill establishes requirements that existing commercial and multifamily buildings 35,000 square feet and larger reduce on-site building emissions 20% by 2030 and achieve a net zero direct emissions by 2040. But the 2040 requirement sunsets in 2029 and must be reauthorized by General Assembly to remain in effect. And many of the bill's other provisions are contingent on the results of about 24 studies and reports related to space and water heating technologies, the readiness of the electric grid, subsidies for building retrofits, economic impacts on small business, manufacturing, and overburdened communities. The regulatory process has considerations for exempting certain types, building types and uses, historic buildings, commercial kitchens, laboratories, manufacturing, and other special uses. And the bill establishes an alternative compliance fee based on the social cost of carbon. But for today, we're focusing for the most part and primarily on the first requirement that existing buildings measure and report on-site greenhouse gas emissions beginning in 2025. At the same time that that's going into effect, the Securities and Exchange Commission has proposed a rule that mandates disclosures for businesses that could overlap the state regulation and have a surprisingly wide scope due to the business-to-business relationships that commercial real estate companies have. This webinar focuses on emissions monitoring and reporting, which provides a benchmark for meeting future performance standards for buildings, but it's also a starting point to really begin to evaluate feasible ways to achieve the state's emissions goals for buildings. So our presenter today is Stuart Kaplow. Stuart's a well-known environmental attorney who has for more than 3 decades represented business interests in this market and across the country. Today, his practice is focused on environmental, social, and governance matters, including advising corporations on strategic management of their greenhouse gas emissions. So with that, I'll thank you again for attending and turn things over to Stuart.
Thank you, Tom. I appreciate the kind words. As you've heard, my name is Stuart Kaplow. As Tom said, and for those of you that I don't know, I'm an environmental attorney who represents primarily real estate interests, but on a more broad basis, business interests. And in the last several years, along with a partner, Nancy Hoods, we have focused on a non-law consulting business of ESG, environmental, social, governance matters, including significantly greenhouse gas emissions. So now you know why I'm the talking head this morning. Let me follow up on what Tom said about what we're going to talk about this morning. As Tom has indicated, Maryland has enacted what truly is the most rigorous state climate law in the country related to greenhouse gas emissions. And I'll spend a couple minutes explaining why I believe Maryland's is truly the most rigorous of all the state enactments. This new law, which was Senate Bill 528 in the just ended 2020 to Maryland General Assembly session, provides a whole host of things in more than 100 pages. And I think Tom did a great job sort of introducing the issues. What we're going to focus on today is this requirement that commercial, and including multifamily buildings with a gross floor area of 35,000 square feet or more, must achieve this 20% reduction in net greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, ultimately move to be net zero in the out years. And January 2030 may seem a long way away to those of you on the call today, but let me quote one sentence from the law. And as an attorney, I'm sort of loath to read law to people. You know, you're all more than quite capable of reading it yourself, but this really is the crux of what we're going to talk about today. The sentence reads, to facilitate the development of building emission standards under this section, the department, that is the Department of the Environment, shall require owners of covered buildings, that's those buildings 35,000 square feet or more, to measure and report direct emissions to the department annually beginning in 2025. The principal sponsor of the bill, Senator Pinsky, made clear that it's the 2024 greenhouse gas emissions that will first be reported to the state in 2025. So businesses need to figure out what those greenhouse gas emissions are, how they're going to measure those direct emissions, and how they're going to report them, all beginning arguably December 31, 2023. Well, that date is a whole lot closer than some of those sort of other out year dates that we can read in the law. Now, Tom made a point that is actually hugely important, and that is that this disclosure, this greenhouse gas emission disclosure, needs to be viewed in a macro context. We need to look at it in terms of what the Securities and Exchange Commission is doing, because literally on March 21st of this year, the SEC released their proposed rule, which mandates category 1, 2, and 3 greenhouse gas emissions, which we'll talk about, And while the Securities and Exchange Commissions, as some of you on this call are probably going, yeah, those guys, they do public companies. We're not a public company, not our problem. No, it's much more than that, because their requirements will require people downstream and upstream in the supply chain of public companies to begin making disclosures. So that law is far deeper than the new Maryland law. The new Maryland law arguably tracks Category 1 emissions, maybe. And we're going to talk about that today. But the Maryland mandate, while somewhat different than the federal one, again, needs to be looked at in context. On a micro basis, we're going to talk about some solar panels. And we're going to look at all of this in light of sort of the overarching umbrella that this all falls under today. This huge business and societal shift to ESG, environmental social governance matters. So let me specifically over the next, we got about 80 minutes left, 5 things we're going to talk about so you can sort of note where we go. The first I'm going to call Maryland resets its business trajectory with Senate Bill 528. That's what we've already sort of introduced to you. Second, we're going to talk about the SEC climate change rule as transformative at a cost. Again, this idea that we need to also watch what the federal government is doing in this space. Third, a glossary of greenhouse gas terms. I think it's important that we all use the same language, and that may be important because the Maryland legislature used some very different language than the SEC used, and even different language than EPA uses. So let's see what the words actually mean. A quick refresher guide on the science of greenhouse gas. And let's just say, sure, you should listen to a lawyer giving a science lesson. That's a good idea. And then finally, we're going to talk about what I view as sort of some opportunities for commercial landlords, just so we end on a very positive note, because some of this is a little nervous. Now, as a housekeeping matter, you probably don't need to take any notes on what I'm going to say. I'm going to post in the chat some links to our ESG Legal Solutions blog, the blog that Nancy and I post, and all of this comes from a series of articles that we'll post, so you can simply go to those links if you'd like. And as Tom said, and I think Tim also introduced, if you have questions, I recommend putting them in the chat box. I think you will find that this next 80-some minutes is going to be a whole lot more fun if you ask questions. If I just talk at you for 80-some minutes, well, I'll be bored, but you'll likely be bored also. Final housekeeping matter before we jump into this. I always feel the need to do this when I speak on behalf of any organization, that what we're going to talk about today are my views. Actually, probably my views that I share with my partner in our ESG business, Nancy Hoods, but they don't necessarily represent NAIOP's views or anybody else's views. And the reason that may be important is that as much as I try to avoid the politics of all of this, there's politics in all of this. This is government action. This is legislative action, executive branch action. And we'll talk about how even the interaction in Maryland between the legislative branch and the executive branch led to some of where we are today. So again, if this whole topic of, a new area of the law, now you've got to start figuring out how to calculate your greenhouse gases so you can tell the government what they are and worry about liability from third parties that might sue you if you get it wrong. If any of that makes you uneasy, then you're probably doing this right. Now, all kidding aside, this whole idea of ESG, of environmental social governance, including the subset of climate change, which is what Senate Bill 528 is all about, and then greenhouse gas emissions, which is sort of the trigger that we're going to be talking about today, the disclosure and ultimately the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. I respectfully suggest to you that it presents the biggest business opportunity in history, literally waiting to be unlocked. So as Tim said, I think that many of us hope that this is the first of a series of conversations that NAIOP is able to facilitate on the topic. Now, I don't want to oversell where we're going today and where future programs are going to go. In particular, when we're talking about ESG and the impact on commercial real estate. But I was at a program the other day where the speaker, and I'm going to steal his line and paraphrase a bit, but I'm going to steal from the speaker at that program. He said that the application of ESG to commercial real estate is bigger than the installation of the first glass windows in buildings. Again, I think that we need to look at this entire subject in context under a larger umbrella. Nancy and I, in our practice, as I sort of wrap up this final housekeeping matter, I think we want you to understand and appreciate that we advise our clients that profits can come from not from creating the world's problems, but from solving them. And if we look at it from that perspective, there actually are opportunities in what we're going to talk about today. So if green building, where many of you know I cut my teeth over a number of years, if green building is about doing less damage and sustainability is about reaching zero, then these ESG issues, including addressing climate, are all about net plus. They're really about making things better. So businesses often talk about things in terms of net positive. And I enjoyed the discussion in the General Assembly this year, and even in the early draft of this bill and in the early fiscal note, talked about carbon footprint, and it talked about carbon negative and carbon positive, which always confuses me because I think they mean about the same thing. But as we look at how to approach this, certainly this legislation imposes a responsibility on the commercial real estate industry. But I would respectfully say for the time we have today, and as you look at this topic into the future, that you also consider the opportunities. In our practice, we advise clients about being net plus. We have models for net plus. We're not going to talk today. If you want to reach me some other time, I'm happy to do it. I'm not here to sell our greenhouse gas models. I'm going to talk about a bunch of very good ones that are out there in the public space. We certainly have our own, as do others. But what I'd like to say to you is, in a sort of final positive note before we delve into Senate Bill 528, I look at this as sort of balancing these existential crises that we face, climate and inequality. And you can't separate the two in this bill because this bill is a whole lot more than a greenhouse gas bill. So in blunt shorthand, when we talk about this, we talk about the challenges of planetary and human health. And climate, in my way of thinking, is a proxy for the environmental issues, for air and water quality, for biodiversity, which is a huge existential crisis on its own. And then inequality is really a stand-in for the social challenges, the unequal access, the systemic racism, the gender discrimination, the lack of inclusion. And don't fool yourself, that's in this bill too, and we'll talk about that a bit this morning, if only to not delve into it in any great details. My personal belief is Senate Bill 528 is the legislature's a bit clumsy, a bit not so good effort at addressing those climate and inequality issues under the umbrella of climate solutions. So again, we're going to look at this from a commercial real estate interest perspective. We're going to move forward so that hopefully when this call is over this morning, you're going to have more than a mere understanding that there's this new bill and there's this greenhouse gas requirement, but you're going to have some strategic, if not actually sort of tactical approaches in how you're going to address these new requirements in your business, in the real estate enterprises that you're involved in. Okay, let's delve into Senate Bill 528. Senate Bill 528 is legislation that became effective without the governor's signature, and that should not be lost on anybody. The governor, and I want to get the quote correctly, so I want to find it carefully here. The governor referred to this bill as reckless and a controversial energy tax bill. Reckless and a controversial energy tax bill. but it is now the law in Maryland, and literally has been and is going into effect. Literally, if you will, resetting the trajectory, not just for the commercial real estate industry that we're going to talk about, but for the business community in Maryland at large. Now, Tom gave you some of the raw numbers. I want to rehash a couple of those as we begin to look at the bill. The first big thing that the bill does is it talks about that this is a climate change bill. It then states, somewhat fascinatingly to me at least, that the state has the ingenuity to reduce the threat of global warming. And that's the pretense that all of this is done. It's a new finding. We are going much further than Maryland's existing greenhouse gas laws that many of you are well aware exist in terms of talking about these new goals. And Tom gave you some of the numbers, but just to sort of rehash, the bill explicitly requires that the state reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 60% from 2006 levels by 2031, which is a big jump from the 40% and some of the, again, the precise numbers aren't necessarily important. It's a huge increase from where we were, and it's a huge leap from where any other state is. There are some counties, some cities, many of them have lots of express exemptions and carve outs from the bills, but there's no other state that's going this far, this fast at all. So one of the first big kickers here in terms of dates, and there are a lot of dates I'm going to throw at you, and again, you can get them from the blog post and don't need to write them down. But by June 30, 2023, which is not all that far away, the Maryland Department of Environment is supposed to submit a plan for how all of this is going to happen. And that's kind of key because this bill establishes some very broad frameworks. And as Tom said, it sets up at least 4 major study groups. It sets up a whole host of different studies and requirements. In fact, by my count, there are actually, I went through and counted last night in preparation for today, there are actually just over 200 mandates in this 100-page bill. There are actually 208 different requirements sort of buried in this bill. So a lot of this stuff has to happen for us to hit these targets. Let me quickly talk about what we're not going to talk about today in this 100-page bill, because again, I want you to get a flavor for what the legislature is trying to regulate. We just don't have time to get into all the subjects. As much as 90 minutes sounds like an incredibly long time. So we don't have the ability to spend time on things like one of my favorite uncodified provisions. And this bill has a lot of things that are uncodified. That is, things that won't appear in the code, won't appear in the books. It requires that the state evaluate suitable land, real estate, where it can do organic recycling. Because a whole bunch of this bill actually talks about everything from recycling food waste to all types of other organic natural plant material recycling. And that actually is the first subject matter of the bill. We're not going to go there. It's not really it's not a commercial real estate matter. So we just don't have time to get into that. And despite my somewhat unfriendly comments about the bill not being so from an ESG perspective, environmental social governance, the bill doesn't really do a whole lot for social and governance. The next major provisions that we're not going to spend any time dwelling on today are what I call the climate justice provisions. There are true environmental justice requirements in this bill, and don't be fooled. Those are things that actually will be funded by the state, so they will exist. And while I can say that the state hasn't gone far enough with some of these inequality issues, and I might speculate that we're out of step with the country and the globe in some of these issues, be assured that that's the second major topic covered in this bill. So matters of environmental justice are not to be ignored in this. Now, Tom mentioned, and you know, he and the legislative team at NAIOP have done a great job at monitoring the stuff that the Maryland Climate Change Council and others have done. But this bill establishes 4 more groups, big groups. There's some other smaller studies, and there'll be other groups established, working groups in different agencies of the state. But it actually establishes 4 new groups. And some it expressly provides that there'll be members of the commercial real estate industry on. But the reason you care about that is because, as I said a minute ago, this is the beginning. A whole lot has to happen. And some of these provisions even sunset if the legislature doesn't act again in response to the work that these groups do. So this is the first step. And one of the reasons that we can't give you all of the definitive details today is that some of them don't exist. All right. We're also not going to talk about, there are prevailing wage requirements in this bill. There are requirements built into the bill for a bunch of the utility work and a bunch of the infrastructure work that has to be done, the prevailing wages be paid. We're not going to talk about, there were major amendments. They basically rewrote the Chesapeake Conservation Corps program, and they gave it a bunch of money. So it's a program, if you haven't focused on what they're doing and you're interested, you can read that. The climate mitigation and clean energy projects, the bill adds a bunch of examples that go far beyond what the existing law does. Again, a little more than we can talk about today. Some of my favorite provisions, if there's one topic the bill talks about, only second to climate change and spends the most words talking about, those of you that don't know, I think you'll enjoy the fact that it's school buses. It establishes a requirement that by 2025 that counties only buy certain energy efficient zero emitting school buses. It then sets up a school bus pilot program. It sort of funds some school buses. We don't have enough time again to talk about school buses, so we're not. And the other sort of related topic, it talks about zero emission passenger cars and light trucks, and that establishes a target. Interestingly enough, it backs it all the way out to the year 2036, where the state's fleet, their own vehicles that the state of Maryland has, are supposed to be energy efficient, if not zero emission vehicles. Okay, that's a lot of stuff we're not going to talk about. But I hopefully it's giving you a flavor for how broad some of these topics are, literally from composting food waste to counties buying school buses. So what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about what I call the energy conservation requirements for new construction and for existing buildings. And they're substantially similar, but they're not the same. So Tom introduced you to the concept, and I want to give you the full definition. Again, I apologize for reading from the law, but the definition of what's a covered building. So if your building is going to fall within this category, covered building means a commercial or multifamily residential building in the state, or a building that's owned by the state that has a gross floor area of 35,000 square feet or more, excluding the garage area. Covered building does not include a building designated as a historic property, doesn't include a public or non-public elementary or secondary school building, doesn't include a manufacturing building or an agricultural building. Now, there will be regulations that will be issued by MDE that will clarify some of that, I am certain. I would say to you that the number one type of building the state of Maryland builds with your tax dollars are pre-K through 12 schools. They're exempted from this. So if we believe that we're going to make an impact, that's the biggest building type built every year in the state of Maryland. If we're going to try to make an impact in the building sector on greenhouse gases, if you take the largest building type constructed each year out of the mix, not quite sure how we're going to get there so easily. And I would also say my favorite category of building in the definition of agriculture, the way the state does this, the cannabis industry, all those wonderful new growing facilities that we've got for growing cannabis are exempted from the bill. So don't worry, we're not going to negatively impact those of you that smoke. Okay. One of the sleeper provisions in the bill, Tom and I talked about this the other day. One of the sleeper provisions in this bill, beyond pure greenhouse gas emissions, an important definition to understand is that the Maryland Department of Labor must adopt the 2018 International Green Construction Code by January 1 of 2023, and then adopt each subsequent version of the code every 18 months after it's released by the ICC. We could do a whole program on why that requirement is there and what it means. But what I would say to you is, if you want to look for the quiet sleeper, single sentence provisions of this bill that may well have a positive impact on the commercial real estate industry, governments have been authorized on a voluntary basis, should they wish to adopt the IGCC, the International Green Construction Code. By and large, it has not happened because the Department of Labor has not adopted the code so that it then can be adopted by the counties. This has been something the current administration has chosen not to do. The prior administration chose not to do it. The legislature is now stepping in and saying, hey, you guys have chosen not to do this, we're going to do it. The reason it matters, for two substantive reasons, and hopefully we'll have some time before we wrap up today to get into those in detail. The International Green Construction Code has its own energy requirements. It has separate energy requirements from the International Energy Conservation Code, the IECC, that are otherwise adopted by the state of Maryland and set the floor in Maryland for what all projects have to, the requirements that all projects have to meet in all local governments. So it's got a different energy measure, and it can be a very positive energy measure depending upon your building type. Number two, and dramatically, it has a variance and waiver procedure. So it has a procedure where you can go to the local code official and say, hey, I can't meet this requirement of the code. So in lieu of that, I would propose we do this. And the local code official can give you a variance or waiver, something generally not available and very little used in the state of Maryland in building codes. So again, a single sentence in the bill, sort of a sleeper provision, but a big deal as we try to build more energy efficient buildings is the fact that the International Green Construction Code will become statewide and available for everybody to use beginning January 1, 2023 in Maryland. Okay, existing buildings. The Maryland Department of Environment is required by this bill to establish performance standards for existing buildings that fall within this 35,000 requirement. And again, I'm not going to bore you with repeating all the numbers, but this 20% reduction in net direct greenhouse gas emissions by January 1, 2030. That's a very important phrase, and we're going to talk about what direct and net direct greenhouse gas emissions means. And again, that ratchets up, and then we've got to ultimately get to net zero requirements. And there are different requirements for buildings as opposed to the state as a whole. But the issue here is, importantly, Tom made reference to this, and I think I touched on it. If MDE hasn't established the standard and hasn't brought it back to the legislature, this provision that we achieve a net zero requirement, some instances by 2040, some by 2045, it actually sunsets in 2029. It's one of the funny provisions of this bill that it has a series of triggers that requires additional legislative action by the Maryland General Assembly. And if I can do a quick advertisement, as inappropriate as it is, this is why you need Tom. No, this is really why NAIOP's legislative effort is so important, because all of this is going to happen down the road, all of those details. And as much as this bill is a little scary to some, it's a whole lot less scary than it started out. And these requirements have an opportunity to become downright wacky, if the industry doesn't participate as the Maryland Department of Environment and others go forward. One of the other very important provisions in this bill, and I know I'm bouncing around a little bit, but I'm actually tracking the bill in the order that this sort of appears, because again, it's over 100 pages long, and there's a whole lot here. There is an alternative compliance pathway built into the bill. The problem is it doesn't work right now. So there is this concept that an owner can pay a fee in lieu if it can't meet its greenhouse gas emission requirements. One of the difficulties was there was a lot of debate. There was language in the bill, language out of the bill. But the idea, though, was that this would I think I can paraphrase that it was going to be tied to the social cost of carbon. This idea that you can equate 40 some dollars or $50 a ton for carbon, and maybe people want to raise that number to 110, $120 a ton, but there's this social cost of carbon. And that sounded really good when the legislature acted, except just before the bill became law, the federal appeals court overturned the EPA requirement that they were attempting to impose in the state of Louisiana, saying that the EPA doesn't have authority to establish the social cost of carbon. That's kind of a big deal because the Maryland bill is tied to EPA's social cost of carbon. What I would suggest is that whether or not this provision is amended, there are other ways of doing this. And if we look to one of the way that some of the local jurisdictions in California are doing this, and it's worth spending a couple of minutes on this because this is what happens if you don't meet these requirements. So what's happening, we have a client in Cupertino, California, and in Cupertino, their requirements, a small community in California, interestingly enough, very wealthy community where businesses and the residential community can likely afford to pay fees in lieu. But their provision, if you don't meet the requirements of their local community greenhouse gas requirement, their 20% reduction is you pay a fee on an annual basis of 20% of your utility bill. And their utility bill is gas, electric, water, and trash. As well as, interestingly enough, internet. They have this sort of large definition of utility bill. It's all utilities. And then an 8% fee, administrative fee on it. So in effect, you would pay 28% of your total utility bills on an annual basis as your fee in lieu. Certainly something that's a little scary, I think, to most, if not nearly all, real estate owners. So again, there is this alternative compliance path. We're going to see it thrashed out what it really is, because I believe what was generally contemplated by the legislature and what was talked about by the departments probably doesn't work, at least in the short term, until EPA gets its act together. What I would also say to you is that there are some single sentence sleeper provisions in here that will require additional regulations, but are very powerful. So one of them is that electric companies and gas companies must provide specified energy data to covered building owners for benchmarking requirements. I know we get questions all the time about, how do I get this information from my tenants that aren't required to give it to me? And as many of you know who have really gotten into this, the local utilities in Maryland will mask the data and provide it to you. Now they're going to provide you with more data. Because again, the building owner is the party required to actually do this reporting, not the tenant necessarily in the building, although the tenants may be responsible for the greenhouse gas emissions. Now, there are some interesting exceptions in this definition of covered building beyond those that I talked about that appear later in the bill. So beyond your agricultural buildings, beyond your cannabis grow facility, inside the building owner does not need to report greenhouse gases related to certain specified food service facilities. So the bottom line is, if you have a restaurant on the first floor that actually cooks food, their greenhouse gases are going to be excluded from the direct greenhouse gases that the state tracks. There's another fascinating two-sentence provision in this bill that says, and again, it's uncodified language, so you won't find it in the statute. You have to actually look at the original bill. It requires the Maryland Green Building Council to examine the use of environmental product declarations to measure the climate impact of concrete procured by the state. And it goes on in the second sentence saying it's the intent of the state to use low or no carbon concrete. Scares the EBGBs out of me. If I get to choose things in this bill that are scary, we've looked at, and certainly we have clients who have been involved in low carbon concrete. We represent one of the trade groups in this space, and this is not a new topic. Interestingly enough, they made this a requirement of the Maryland Green Building Council. They might have made it a requirement of the Maryland Department of Transportation, who have been testing low carbon concrete products in roads and driveways for years now. And we actually have some sections of highway in Maryland, but they intend that the state of Maryland, and it's not just the state of Maryland the way this works, but it would include, for example, local elementary school, local K through 12 school construction, would in short order be using low carbon concrete. And this is one of those provisions that kicks in this year. And the requirement is that the report be to the legislature by December 1, 2022 for legislation to be enacted next session requiring the use of low and no carbon concrete. Those of you that are into those issues, there's very little of that product available today in the state of Maryland because there are issues with it, but we're going there. Another uncodified provision that makes me nervous, and it should trouble some of you, if not all of you. You know, if I can be inappropriate for a minute and say, the purpose of this bill is to move us away from carbon, but towards electric buildings. And whether that makes any sense or not, we can talk about, and we will talk about in a minute. But the purpose of the bill is really to move us to electric buildings, all electric buildings. So there's an uncodified provision of this bill that it requires the Maryland Department of Labor, which is where the Maryland Codes Administration is today. And again, a program for another day on why it's at the Department of Labor, but it requires that they develop recommendations for all electric building code and that they prepare an all electric building code for the state. And as some of you who were involved in this bill during the session may know, the legislature was looking for an all electric building code. And while there are two out there, neither of them really are particularly robust. And the state determined that it couldn't adopt one of the two that are out there. So it's told the Department of Labor to draft its own. So the fact that the Maryland Department of Labor is going to draft an all electric building code is interesting. Fortunately, that provision does, and I enjoy it. It talks about that the department may go out and hire consultants and experts to do the study and draft the code, which is only interesting because other provisions of this bill expressly talk about how the Maryland Energy Administration may not hire any consultants, may not hire experts, and may not hire additional staff, and must use additional staff to do work. But I think there's some recognition that this is sort of a big deal. Of course, none of that's funded at this point, but those provisions are in there. There's a bunch of work by the Maryland, by the Public Service Commission that has to happen, and a whole lot of this has to happen by the Public Service Commission. But importantly, the bill expressly expands Empower Maryland, the Empower Maryland program, which does provide some very real benefits to folks, including the commercial real estate industry. Now, there's some other sort of interesting single sentence provisions. The bill establishes beginning next year that personal property can be exempt from state property taxes if it meets certain requirements, including being a community solar system. So when they do your property assessments of your buildings, I'm not quite sure the legislature understood what happens when you attach or affix something to a building and it becomes a fixture, and then SDAT doesn't consider it personal property and they assess it. But in any event, the concept here is that certain solar power installations on buildings, that those systems will be exempt from property taxes in the state of Maryland. I'm not quite sure SDAT is going to see it as broadly as the legislature did. So I expect we'll see some additional language. And then the bill also does say that the state will provide up to 5% additional costs for those local governments for their pre-K through 12 schools that aren't subject to this bill, if they choose to build net zero schools. So the very good lobbying arm of the pre-K through 12 school system got themselves completely exempted from the bill in terms of requirements, but got themselves 5% additional state money for building schools. I'm always impressed when people do such a good job. There is actually some money allocated in the bill to the commercial real estate industry, actual cash dollars. The difficulty is, and do not laugh when I say this, and please do not call because I'm sure it's gone. But included in each annual budget beginning next year is to be $5 million, in the Department of Housing and Community Development in a new grant program to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in multifamily residential buildings. Now, the problem is, as you know, those of you who are in the industry will appreciate, if you actually renovate one fairly large building and do all the things that are necessary, you're going to spend more than $5 million on that first building. I'm also troubled by the fact that there's currently $12 million in that account allocated in last year's budget that already existed. So as a practical matter, we went from 12 to $5 million. But there is, I would say the positive in that is there is some recognition, there is some acknowledgement in that there are very real costs associated with doing a lot of what has to happen here. I want to go back and say that, sort of repeat what I said a minute ago, that there are a lot of future regulations. There's a lot of stuff that has to happen in these working groups and otherwise. And I really think it's important that the industry participate to sort of, our word, de-risk the implementation of all of this. You know, I think NAIOP has been a trusted partner of the state in many of these things, but the bottom line is the state is literally going to rewrite a lot of these rules to do this stuff. And you guys need to participate because this requirement, and I want to go back where we started, that the 2024 greenhouse gas emissions are those that get reported in 2025. So you need to understand what greenhouse gas emissions are. You need to then understand what the possibilities are for calculating them, and then for reporting them, recognizing the potential that there is some potential jeopardy, not only to the government, but to other stakeholders if you report this stuff potentially inaccurately. Now, I think that it is important also to dwell, and we're going to go there in 1 minute, on the fact that there is this other regulatory bugaboo out there, the SEC, and it's huge, and it may well trump a great deal of what the state of Maryland is doing, because it's a nationwide requirement, and interestingly enough, it's a global requirement. You know, is an interesting footnote, and I know I'm a lawyer, so I get fascinated by these things, but the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, in their new regulation, wrote in the very first sentence that it was a global requirement. So they wanted to regulate people, not just in the United States, but businesses outside the United States. And to make that point, in the very first enforcement action they brought last month, they actually brought an enforcement action against a Brazilian mining company for violating disclosure requirements in the ESG space. So understand that just because we say state of Maryland, it may not be quite that simple. You know, many businesses that are outside the state of Maryland, but simply own a building that will meet these requirements in the state of Maryland, are of course then subject to these requirements. So that we're not simply talking about the space of local Maryland real estate developers, owners, and operators. Now, there's a knock on the bill. I'm looking at some of the chat, and it's a fair knock on the bill. Yes, again, outside of the scope of what we can really talk about today, but the bill does unfairly burden, this is a climate change bill, and it does unfairly burden the real estate industry. You know, arguably, Maryland real estate is responsible for about 18% of the greenhouse gas emissions, and the transportation sector is responsible for 40%, based on some numbers EPA puts out there. Certainly, transportation is bigger than real estate. And this bill is sort of silent, not sort of silent, it is silent, except for school buses and state and state transportation. I think the legislature could only bite off so much this session. I know Senator Pinsky certainly talked about coming back next year and doing some transportation stuff. We'll see how that all goes. But it is a fair knock to say that real estate appears to be the target of this bill, and a lot of other stuff is not. There are probably two things that are not in the bill that I want to mention before we move on. The one thing that's not in the bill is there was a version of this bill early on that had a requirement that all newly constructed buildings be electric only. And that provision is not in the bill. But as I've talked about a couple of times now, there is this requirement that the Maryland Department of Labor do a study, write a report, deliver it to the legislature later this year, including drafting an all-electric building code. And what I would say to you is almost certainly, if you want to take out your crystal ball, you can prognosticate that all of that work, while some of it is to be reported by December of this year, they're supposed to have that code in 15 months. I think you can count on the fact that we will see at least legislation, whether it's enacted or not, we'll see legislation for an all-electric building code for new construction 2 years out. That is a legislative session after the 15 months run. So not in the bill. You can read it all you want. You're not going to see that requirement, but I think it's an important provision that's not in the bill. And the second important provision that's not in the bill, that again is something we could spend another 90 minutes talking about, amended out of this bill and of great import was all the language that granted permission to local governments to exceed the state law and required emission reductions. So those of you that are not familiar with the topic, think Montgomery County. So Montgomery County currently has an ordinance that goes a whole lot further than some of these requirements related to energy. You know, no one's asking, and I'm not giving in a seminar like this legal advice. I'm not sure their ordinance withstands a challenge given this state law. But for another day, that provision that was in the bill is out, and Montgomery County certainly has moved forward. Okay, so if we accept the fact that we've got these greenhouse gas emission requirements that exist, it is by almost any measure sort of this big, hairy, and audacious goal of those of you that have never measured your greenhouse gases, and there are some somewhat authoritative reports that talk about nationwide, less than 1% of businesses have ever actually calculated their greenhouse gas emissions. And I have no reason to believe that in Maryland that number is any higher. How's this work? What are you going to do? And again, the devil is in the details here. And what I want to do is pivot and talk about what the SEC is requiring so you can then understand what you're required to calculate in Maryland. And that may be this concept of the legislation in Maryland uses, you know, I get to say this because I'm not a member of the General Assembly, inartful words. It talks about direct emissions. And the reason direct emissions is, from a lawyer perspective, not a good thing is because the federal government, EPA, defines indirect emissions, but in this space, we talk about category 1, 2, and 3 emissions. The industry and the EU, the Europeans that have regulations in this space, the British that have regulations in this space, even the state of California, state of Florida, state of New York, nobody talks about direct emissions. So we've used some language that's very non-standard. And the fact that it's non-standard language makes it less than 100% clear what is to be calculated, which means a very significant amount of work down the road for NAIOP and others to talk about that. So let's look at that issue a little bit. So as we've sort of beat this horse, this U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission last month established their own requirement mandating climate change disclosures by private companies. First time, big deal, this idea at a federal level. Remember, Maryland's the first state to do this. Hasn't gone into effect yet. SEC put out this requirement that they believe is going to be finalized this summer, and these rules are going to kick in for companies' annual reports in 2022 if SEC gets its wish. First problem with the SEC rule is it's 500 pages. So the Maryland law was only 100 quick pages to skim through, but the federal law is over 500 pages and has a whole lot of stuff in it. Most significant is that for the first time, the SEC is mandating that information about climate-related risks, expressly including calculations of greenhouse gas emissions, be reported. Now, this is not necessarily new for the SEC, and some of you know, we've been doing this work actually for 12 years now, for more than 10 years. The SEC has required climate change calculations by public companies. And we do a lot of that work for them, and why our greenhouse gas model is old and may not meet Maryland's current requirements, but it met the SEC's requirements when they went into effect 12 years ago. But again, so for literally more than a decade, we have helped companies, public companies, calculate greenhouse gases. But again, the big change here, the big sort of deal, and we're going to look at this when we look at some definitions in a minute, is this distinction between scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. And the shorthand response is scope 1 are what I would say are what you do yourself in your own space. So those emissions that you generate in your place of business within the four walls of your building. Scope 2 are generally, think about if you purchase electricity, you purchase it from a utility. The scope 2 are those forms of energy you buy from someplace else you're not generating on site. And scope 3, this is where it really gets scary. It's everything upstream and downstream in the value chain. So those people, those businesses that are your suppliers, you need to know what their greenhouse gas emissions are so you can calculate them. And then people that you sell to and how they use your products and services, you need to know what their greenhouse gas emissions are so that you can calculate your scope 3. And that's where it gets a little woolly. And I can tell you that we've done some of this work for some very large companies. And I looked again last night to get ready for today. I looked at the last one that I had touched about a week ago. And in their scope 3 analysis, we have 900 columns in our little Excel spreadsheet. That is, we're tracking 900 factors to be able to calculate their scope 3. And you don't ever want to calculate 900 of anything when you have to report it. You have to come up with a raw number at the end. So we'll talk about this more a bit more in a bit, but I wanted to sort of give you the sense of this scope 1, 2, and 3. And the reason is that Maryland talks about, this new Maryland law talks about direct emissions, which I think many people equate with scope 1, that is stuff in your space. And what I would say to you is, I don't make that analogy. I don't think it's that simple. Be assured, if the Maryland Department of Environment wanted it to be scope 1, they would have said scope 1. So I think that this is a topic that we need to pay attention to, but what are your direct emissions? I think that you may assume that they are not necessarily scope 3 emissions, but what they are beyond not having to go upstream and downstream in your value chain. I would say to you, that is a subject for another day for these regulations as we go forward.
Stuart, let me provide a little bit of context to the why Maryland is different, if I can.
Please.
The origin is in the way that the state's greenhouse gas inventory is established and the way that they assign responsibility for mitigation. The building sector is responsible for on-site combustion of fossil fuels. Utilities are responsible for emissions that are at power generating stations. And there's a automobile sector, transportation sector that's responsible for mobile emissions from cars and trucks, airplanes, ships, whatever. So it's a way that the state has established its method of tracking and assigning responsibility that's different than the voluntary scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 kind of approach that's been adopted by a lot of publicly traded companies and others. So that's the reason, and it's kind of embedded in the regulatory history and the management plans that have been in place since 2009.
100% correct. And I would only add to that, if that historic regulatory structure withstands this new program and these new programs, it's a win for the commercial real estate industry. It's a good thing. It's a positive thing. I'm a little skeptical by nature. I'm a little skeptical that's going to hold up. And what I would say is that without going too far out on a tangent and answering one of the questions in the chat, which is sort of what are direct emissions? Fair question. I probably skipped over a little bit. I think Tom has sort of assisted with the definition, but direct emissions depend upon geographically where you are, and there are some requirements in the EU that are a little different than the United States. And again, it's a big deal when if you're a company that may be based here, but you sell a certain amount of product in Europe, certain amount of product in Great Britain even, you then have to at times meet their reporting requirements also. And that's the same thing that we're seeing with other companies who sell in the United States with this SEC determining that their rule is global. So the general rule, and again, interestingly enough, in the United States, we very often look to EPA does a wonderful job with its definitions. And I'll do a bit of a shameless self-promotion. I just posted, if you click on the links I just put in the chat, we just provided a glossary that we have on our blog of some of these terms, and also the scientific background, where we describe in detail and give you definitions with links to these terms. But let me quickly, for those of you who are not going to link or not going to click on the links, let me just say direct emissions in a real estate perspective are, as Tom just suggested to you, it's generally the combustion of natural gas generally, but other petroleum products for heating, cooking, and other needs in the building, on the space, on the real estate. And that's sort of the biggest piece of it. Those emissions from natural gas tend to be the biggest piece. And it's interesting that where that's the easy answer, that's not the way the EU does it. What the EU does is they also require that you include calculations for organic waste, that is waste, trash, other stuff that leaves your property and goes to a landfill. And then ultimately you need to calculate what's emitted from your organic and inorganic waste that goes to a landfill. They also require, and interestingly enough, California requires in its definition, that you also calculate wastewater treatment plant discharges. So the stuff, the wastewater that leaves your facility generates a direct emission requirement. There are also anaerobic digestive issues that the EU requires be calculated. And what I would say is the EU has had some controversy, and they went in a different direction than Great Britain went, and a very different direction than California, but fluorinated gases. And this is sort of a big deal in Maryland because we don't have a good regulation here. So that's the stuff that goes in your air conditioning systems. That's the stuff that escapes from your refrigeration systems during servicing or leaking. And there are requirements that you find a way to track that and calculate it and report it. So the idea of direct emissions is not as simple as simply the gas that you burn on your property as opposed to the electricity that comes to your property. Let me, because we're moving along time-wise here, let me point out that in the chat box, as I said a minute ago, I did link you to the glossary for greenhouse gas terms that we have on our blog. And that is, I would respectfully say, the 34 words you need to be able to talk about this topic. So everything from alternative energy to definitions of atmosphere. And I think one of the concepts that is introduced there is this idea of, that is not in the Maryland law, that I believe the consultants have told the state they need to add into the regulations, which is this idea of global warming potential. So you may want to familiarize with the concept of global warming potential. You'll see it throughout our definitions. Again, probably more than we can do today, but as a practical matter, CO2 has a global warming potential of 1 on this scale. So, and we look to other greenhouse gases and we look to see which ones are better or worse. That is, which greenhouse gases do more harm. So in global warming potential, carbon dioxide has a 1, nitrous oxide has a 298. So arguably nitrous oxide, which there's much less of, in the atmosphere does much greater harm to the atmosphere. Methane, which everybody talks about, it probably is about a 25, though EPA is currently fighting what it is. Interestingly enough, sulfur hexafluoride, which is actually kind of a big deal, because while it's a very modest greenhouse gas in terms of quantity, EPA, just along with the World Health Organization, just updated the number that if CO2 is a 1, sulfur hexafluoride is a 22,800. So you don't want much of that in the atmosphere. Again, a little beyond our conversation today. So I think that Nancy's actually posting again some links to the blogs. That those of you I see some of you can actually click on the links that I provided. If you go to our blog, each of these are actually are listed there. Understand that a lot of this is appreciating the details of greenhouse gas emissions. A lot of this is appreciating not just what a greenhouse gas is. It's very nice to be able to read a bunch of complicated, chemical names, but then what do you do about that? How do you ultimately reduce those greenhouse gas emissions? And that is really key to this. I'm looking at the chat. There are no forms or requirements yet for reporting. All of this is brand new, as I hope I've accurately expressed that this is the statute. There will be regulations. There will be reporting requirements. I'm sure MDE will generate a format for reporting, if not literally forms. I certainly don't want to put words in their mouth, but there will be a mechanism or a format. As many of you who are, if you make, other requirements, wastewater discharge requirements, other reports to MDE now, there are formats and regulation that folks are refused to use. Is it a loophole, or is there a way that you could get a max capacity 2024 and then report less in 2025? Again, we're looking at the statutes and not the regulations, but I think that question, I'd like not to answer it literally, but let me give what I believe is the correct answer. Remember, I mentioned a minute ago that MDE is supposed to establish building regulations and standards by building types. So arguably, they're going to do it by building types. But you're going to be making some reporting requirements before you're required to reduce by 20%. I would say to you that it would not be wise to just guess high. It would not be a good thing to necessarily not give a lot of thought to what greenhouse gas number you're reporting to the state and make an effort to report it as accurately as you can. Because again, I respectfully say, despite the fact the state's going to establish standards, a government is hard pressed when there's a statutory requirement saying that you have to reduce by 20% to say that you have to reduce by 20% off of some figment of their imagination, as opposed to your real number. So your real number matters. Your real number means something, and how you calculate that number on the planet in your first couple of years of reporting before there's a mandate to reduce, but I'm going to leave that to others to conclude. I'm sliding back up on the chart. Okay, so if you want to actually do this on your own now, if you want to sort of look at what are your greenhouse gas emissions? What do they look like? There are some places you can do that fairly easily that are fairly authoritative and are relatively good. I promised when I agreed to do this presentation that I was not going to turn it into a 90-minute commercial for the greenhouse gas calculator that we have, our proprietary one, and I won't do that. But what I'll say to you is that just like we have one, there are other consultants, there are other law firms that have their own greenhouse gas calculators, because there has been a federal requirement that certain public companies at least determine the impact greenhouse gases have on their climate change and make an annual assessment of this. Whether they determine to report it or not is another measure, but they have been required to do this calculation now for 12 years. So there are calculators out there. We have them in others, and I think, to be blunt, you're better served using a proprietary one than using a free one off a government website. you're always better off using something that's not free from a government website. But let me tell you where, if you want to just do this on your own, you want to get off the phone today and get off this call and just get a sense of what your greenhouse gases look like. The EPA has 3 very good ones, and you get very different results. What I'd actually suggest you do is run at least 2 of the 3, if not all 3, and you'll see how different the numbers can be. I think a lot of people on this call are familiar with Energy Star Portfolio Manager, and you use it for different reasons. If you actually put your data in Energy Star Portfolio Manager, it takes a bit of work, but if you do that or you otherwise run Energy Star, if you actually go to the report section, actually about the third to the last screen, one of the options that you have is to actually turn it into a greenhouse gas emission calculator. And it has some very nice reports, graphs, charts, they're beautiful. But it's a way that the commercial real estate industry, large sectors of you use it, and we use Energy Star for our multifamily residential clients because we're required to by Fannie and Freddie Mac. We then overlay our proprietary greenhouse gas calculator and give them those numbers, but we're required to run Energy Star. So EPA's Energy Star Portfolio Manager, one way you can do this yourself today and get an order of magnitude of what you're talking about. Number 2, EPA also has on its website in the upper left-hand corner now something called Greenhouse Gas Equivalencies Calculator. Click on the box. It was just updated in March of this year. So it includes some of the newest language, some of the newest calculations. It actually gives you 2 options for what you want to do, whether you want to put your energy data in or whether you want to actually enter it manually. And what I would say to you is put your energy data in. Don't worry so much about your emissions data, and then let it generate a report. It's not going to comply with the Maryland rule per se, because it's not going to be just category 1 or direct, but it really actually gives you a very, I would argue, of the 3 I'm going to tell you about. I told you about Energy Star Portfolio Manager, now EPA Greenhouse Gas Equivalencies Calculator. It may be the best one of the 3 in terms of, from our perspective, for many building types. Again, no one homogeneous building type. This all varies from different building type. It's a very good calculator. And then number 3, for those of you who have no patience, I don't want to say for those of you that are lazy, but for those of you that don't have the ability to sit there and input all the data, and you're going, I got to hire a consultant, or I got to dedicate an employee to get started doing this. EPA has their simplified greenhouse gas emission calculator. It's a shorthand way of doing this. And what I would say is it almost certainly, it's never going to meet the Maryland requirement, but version 7, which is, they have several versions on their website. The latest version, version 7, is actually pretty damn good. If you just want to get a sense of where you are and how all this works and what your greenhouse gas emissions look like, and you don't want to actually go back and find your utility bills for the last year, the last 12 months and start inputting them, EPA's simplified greenhouse gas emissions calculator is a way to do it. And despite the fact that I like to think that programs like this offer you some insight and some value, what I would say is that until you actually run some numbers and see what your greenhouse gas numbers are, you're not really going to understand this and understand what you can put in and what you might not have to put in. So I would actually encourage you, look, of course, you can call us, any of the consultants you know, any of the other lawyers you know, and we'd be happy to run our proprietary systems for you, I assure you. This is the world that we're living in today. But if you just want to do this on your own, these 3 offer you realistic ways to wrap your arms around this. And I would say to you that it is a big deal. Let me move on to some of the questions in the chat. I want to try to at least get some of those, and I will answer the ones that we don't get on this call afterwards. There are actually 2 questions about embodied carbon. I would say that, so embodied carbon is sort of that existing carbon, and that, you know, I make the argument, if you want to think about embodied carbon, the greenest building, the building that emits the lowest greenhouse gas emissions, is an existing building. So don't build a new building, renovate your existing building, and you will be able to not you'll be able to address the issues, the concerns about embodied carbon that exist. As some of you know, it's all over their website. Nancy and I are very lucky. We are actually doing work on a pilot project. The American Institute of Architects, AIA, is redoing its headquarters, and they are actually doing they have done a very detailed embodied carbon study, which they are going to make available to the public as the building construction moves forward. But they are making up for all of the many, many dozens of metric tons of embodied carbon in their existing building. It's a whole different space. It's all beyond what we're talking about today. But what I would say is that there is a whole lot of work that can be done in this area for others that goes far beyond the minimums required by this Maryland law. And one of the advantages, and here, let me answer this question, I appreciate that someone feels that I've been a bit facetious with there are actual opportunities. They're waiting to hear when I talk about the opportunities. So let me mention an opportunity. Let me explain how this works. And actually, I appreciate we have at least 2 comments on that. That's good. Okay. Opportunities. So let me explain how the opportunities work. If you're a commercial landlord, let's just assume for a minute you've got an office building. So under this SEC requirement, under this federal government requirement, public traded companies are going to be required to calculate their tier. Many public traded companies, not all, many, if not most, will be required to report their tier 3 emissions. Let me also say that companies that make claims related to greenhouse gases will be required to report their tier 3 emissions. So if you're one of those companies that has said, oh, our goal is to be greenhouse gas neutral, or we're going to be at 0 greenhouse gases by 2030 or 2045, or we're going to be carbon neutral by 2030, then you fall within this new umbrella of the SEC of having to calculate your tier 3 and report to the SEC. Okay, so you're one of a public company or someone who falls within that new category of having to report. Well, you need your upstream and downstream vendors and customers to report. You need the greenhouse gas numbers from your suppliers, the people you buy raw materials from, but maybe most importantly, you need it from your landlord. So if you're a public traded company and you've got offices all over the country, or you're looking to rent a new office, if you're going to rent from a prospective landlord in Maryland that says, hey, we can give you our greenhouse gas numbers, we can give you our ESG report on our space, and you can then use that as part of your reporting to the SEC, that makes your space a whole lot more valuable than a landlord that has never done those calculations or doesn't have the ability to make that available to the public traded company. And if you think I might be wrong, and it's always possible I'm wrong about these things, what I would say is California is a year ahead of the SEC. California passed a law last year requiring that certain very large businesses report that they calculate their category 3 emissions. And what we've seen in California is a real differentiation in landlords are actually advertising that they have an ability to provide that data to prospective tenants. And what I would tell you is that's a new national model. That's a huge business opportunity that the commercial real estate industry has generally not even touched upon, but the ability to provide that data to those companies that are required to make tier 3 reporting. And that's a big deal because, again, remember, this is not just public companies. This is all of these companies that sell to public companies. So if you're a supplier to a public company, or if you are a customer of a public company upstream and you're buying their products, they need your greenhouse gas data to be able to report. Let me see if there are, Tom is making a point about language in the bill related to utilities. Yes, and again, I apologize. A lot of what I tried to do is focus on the commercial real estate industry. As I said, if you have the time, I mean, it actually is a somewhat entertaining bill to read. There's a link on our blog to it. It's a fun 105 pages. It'll put you to sleep. If you don't sleep at night, put this beside your on your nightstand. I promise it will help you go to sleep. What happens if you don't report and don't pay the 28%? Again, we haven't seen the precise regulations, but it will be it would then fall, if there is not an express enforcement mechanism created, you will fall within the general enforcement mechanisms of the Maryland Department of Environment. And those are those crazy things that they used to be $800 a day, and now they went to $1,000 a day. But after 60 days, they treble and become $3,000 a day. So there is this crazy penalty scheme that MDE has. What I would say is that
I'm guessing that Paul Obrecht's question is about the federal SEC rule, because he's referencing the 28%.
Good point. Okay. The SEC has a tremendous amount of teeth, and the SEC can actually cause you to not do business, and the SEC can actually penalize you $10,000 a day and has the ability to criminalize that. And we've actually seen in the last 30 days, the SEC has brought 3 new cases on ESG violations, all having to do with environmental factors in ESG. And in all of those, the SEC sought huge monetary fines. And you may have read about, I don't want to discuss, not important the name of the bank, but a very large publicly traded bank paid $1.5 million fine to settle with the SEC. And their argument was, we didn't even know we were violating this new rule. We didn't know it had gone into effect yet. And they're seeking almost $100 million from the Brazilian mining company. So the SEC has big teeth that makes this all very, very scary. And what I would say is that it's not that people won't report, but it's likely that people will report inaccurately. But I also believe if you make a good faith effort at reporting and there's simply some clerical error, the SEC is not likely to bring the hammer. Let me wrap up by trying to grab one more of these questions, and then I want to turn it back to Tom Ballantyne as we wrap up here. The quick answer is the last question that I see here is, do solar installations help meet the Maryland greenhouse gas standard? The quick answer is yes, definitely. That is, anything that will reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that you produce on your property. So if you're going to have electricity on your property that is a result of a solar panel on your on-site or even off-site, that causes you to use less fossil fuel, less natural gas, yes, that's a win-win for you. And that's a positive that comes out of this program. I would say that there are complications, and you can read our website with where your solar panels come from. Do they come from, the Uyghur region of China? And in fact, our blog post that we're going to post next Monday talks about the fact that there are brand new requirements related to importing solar panels to go into effect June 21. But yes, solar panels are a win-win. And again, let me turn it back to Tom. I thank you all for listening today. I know it's sort of been all over the place. I urge you, without being too shameless about the promotion, if you go to the blog, I think you'll see that our blog has articles on all of this that click through to the original sources, so you can see why we've reached the conclusions we have. So thank you all very much. Let me turn it back to Tom to wrap us up and get us out of here.
Appreciate that, Stuart. The intent here is to have several webinars like this on specific aspects of this bill. We have some internal discussions now about looking at common practices that can help to meet the 2030 targets, but we're interested in feedback from groups like this about what you want to see, so that it's it's really an open source kind of discussion. 2 or 3 more of these types of webinars are kind of informally scheduled at this point. And the implementation process is one that will have this industry kind of focused on these issues for 3 to 5 years more, right? And it's going to take a really well-organized, unified approach to working through some of the existing questions, fully participating in the work group and reporting processes that have been written into this bill. And it's a level of engagement that we've had at the staff level and with volunteers on our legislative committee, but this level of engagement is going to need to be much broader. So it's really a beginning of a bigger public discussion with new overlapping, sometimes contradictory sorts of requirements to manage. I don't have anything else really to say today. Tim, do you have anything else sort of as a wrap up?
I do. I'd like to thank you and thank everyone for participating. Tom Pilon, who's the chair of our legislative committee, he'd like to share some remarks too. Tom, I invite you on.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Tom. First of all, I just want to just quickly, for those of you who don't know who I am, I'm Tom Pilon with St. John Properties. My role here is, we basically get building permits, make sure we keep things moving through the entitlement process. But my role as both a member of the board of directors of NAIOP and then specifically as the chair of the legislative committee for probably the last decade is to stay engaged as we kind of battle things in Annapolis and try to be proactive when we can be, but oftentimes we find ourselves a bit on our heels. And this would be a good example of something. This is a topic that we've been talking about for quite a while. I think Tom mentioned to me the other day that he was engaged in these things at least as far back as 5 years ago, if not longer. But unfortunately, oftentimes it's when we kind of hit the actual legislation and we get hit with it that kind of draws people out in a way that now we got to understand it better. But first of all, I want to thank Stu for offering to try to break it down into something that we can kind of understand, help them with the education part of it. And thank Tom and Tim and John, I think I saw on here, who's the president of NAIOP currently, for setting this up. But I'd also invite you all to stay involved, and whether it's through the legislative committee or other ways, so you can try to be educated on these things and help us as we kind of work on our advocacy issues in Annapolis. So if you're interested in that, we certainly welcome your participation. I will say that in the over 10 years that I've been the chair of the committee, this is the biggest group of people that I've seen get together to kind of get informed on something, and that's really encouraging. It's a little disappointing, I guess, that it has to happen in a form like this, meaning that we've got legislation we have to deal with. But again, just thank everybody for participating and would encourage you to stay involved. Thanks, Tim, for the time.
Thank you, Tom. And again, thank you, Stuart, for your time this morning. Tom, for your leadership in Annapolis. This concludes the program. We do have an opportunity for you to get together with membership again. We have our summer social coming up on June 22nd with a project tour of the Port Covington project. For those of you who are looking for credit for today, give us about a week and we will have it into the Maryland system and your credit will be there. If it's not there, please feel free to reach out to us. We also may be reaching out to you if we need some additional information to give you that credit. Thank you all for your time this morning. Enjoy the rest of your day.